Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Specialty Drugs, Creating a Compliant and Compassionate Response to High-Cost Claims. My name is Rhonda Williams, and I'm the Director of Marketing for Employee Benefits at Hub International. Hub International is ranked 5th among global brokerages and is a leading provider of business insurance, personal insurance, employee benefits, and risk services. We hope that as you were waiting for the call today that you took a moment to text HUB, H-U-B, to 888-1111. This is an easy way to subscribe to our newsletters and stay on top of topics and events such as the one that we're presenting to you today. So thank you for joining us to learn more on the topic of pharmacy cost management. For business leaders and benefit decision makers, it's important to gain insight on the complicated and costly dilemma that innovative drug therapies create for corporate plans. On today's call, you'll learn from our panelists what options are available and what to consider when evaluating pharmacy costs. Our speakers are Barbara Hawes, National Pharmacy Practice Leader, and Corey Jorbin, Chief Compliance Officer, West Region Employee Benefits. Before we start the presentation, I have a few housekeeping notes for you. Today's presentation is being broadcast through your computer's speaker system and audio controls. If you experience any issues with audio quality during the webinar, a recording will be provided after the event. This is an interactive program, and we've set aside time at the end of the presentation to answer your questions. To ask a question, find the GoToWebinar panel on the right side of your computer screen, click the arrow, and type in your question in the space provided. Feel free to send your questions as they come to mind during the program so we can have them queued and ready once the presenters have ended their presentation. Again, this program is being recorded, and after the webinar, you'll receive a link to the recording to listen again and share with your colleagues. And with that, Barb, welcome, and let me turn the program over to you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. The topic for today's agenda really came directly from you, our clients and prospects. And there's our glamour shots of Corey and I. So like I was saying, the topic for the agenda really did come directly from clients and prospects. In my role as Hub's National Pharmacy Practice Leader, it's my job to support clients, producers, and account teams with all things pharmacy. Everything from, is my contract competitive? Are those tweets I read online last night really going to happen? Can we schedule a field trip to Canada to get our medications? And everything in between. As a pharmacist working with employers for over 30 years, I've seen a lot of change. But what benefits professionals are facing today is truly unprecedented. At the end of the day today, by far the most pressing issue for our clients is easily managing high-cost specialty medications. So let's look at our agenda and get started. We're going to go over a little bit of background, specialty drugs and their impact on plans. Some of you could lead this section. Then we'll walk through some of the emerging solutions in the market. We think the market is immature. More solutions will come, but there are some out there today. And this conversation wouldn't be complete without understanding some of the limitations in these solutions and even potential compliance risks. This is where Corey will jump in and lead us through that part of the conversation. Finally, like Rhonda said, we are going to try really hard to stay on task so we have time for questions at the end. Let's get started. Our case study is titled Critical Dilemma Case Study, but it could also be called A Day in the Life of a Benefits Manager, and that could be at any employer, any town, USA. So picture this. Renewals are successfully negotiated, open enrollment is done, 1-1 glitches are finally ironed out, and now you get time for a little breather. Nope, not really. Here comes Marge or Jerry from accounting. Barb, what is going on with our pharmacy plan? The claim request has been running 85 to 100 grand for the past 6 months, and now 3 months in a row we are over 200,000. You have got to do something. This is not sustainable. We have not budgeted for this with all kinds of hair on fire type expletives to go with it. Has this ever happened to any of you? Sadly, it's not all that uncommon. Today, there are multiple conditions with drug treatments that cost $50,000 per month and will continue to cost $50,000 per month for the patient's lifetime. This isn't like the hepatitis treatments that we had a few years ago where a $100,000 treatment would produce a cure, and after 12 weeks of pain, you were through it. This is the catastrophic claim that keeps on giving. More devastating to plans is the fact that many of these conditions are hereditary, inherited, and they run in families. So there may be more than one family member being treated with the same treatment or medication. In our case study, the employer eventually figured out that a brand new hire brought both a spouse and a child to the plan with a rare genetic disorder. So literally overnight, the pharmacy expense to the entire company doubled because of one new employee. When this kind of unprecedented cost comes out of nowhere, it's no surprise that grief, panic, mad scramble may occur. This is when you really need a trusted, and I mean trusted, advisor by your side. What might go through your head may not be rational. Employers, I've sat with many of them as they go through the stages of grief and grapple with this type of situation. Initial reactions can be all over the board. We're going to go bankrupt. Our premiums are going to be so high. All of our best people are going to leave. We're not going to be able to recruit. We've got to get rid of this cost burden. Can we move this person to the state exchange? Could we help this person get recruited to another company? What if we meet them in a dark alley with a cash settlement? Like I said, you need your trusted advisor at your side. Then we take a deep breath and we get more practical. Can we exclude the drug from coverage? Could we find a better formulary? Do we need a new PBM? What about all the other drugs like this? Maybe we should exclude all specialty drugs. Don't worry, there is hope. There are solutions in the market today, and this is when you need your trusted benefits advisor at your side. Unfortunately, there are no silver bullets and there are no cookie cutter solutions. Today, we're going to talk about options that employers can review. They may not be right for every company, but you can't make a good decision without all the information. In the interest of time, we're going to have to move pretty quickly. Let's look at a bit of background information. Prescription drug costs have been increasing very quickly since the 1960s to today, where the average employer is spending about $1,000 per active employee per year, which may be 20% or more of all employer health plan costs. When I started in this business, pharmacy spend more than 10% was cause for alarm. One thing to note on the graph here is that costs really started to rise after the Orphan Drug Act in 1983. Along with this new legislation, other breakthroughs in research and development brought us the first wave of specialty drugs. As many of you know or have heard in your annual reviews, specialty drugs are what's driving this cost increase. In 2020, we expect fully 50% of employer prescription drug costs to be specialty costs. What exactly is a specialty drug? Most of us know it's a high-cost drug for a complex condition that may require special handling, dosing, monitoring, storage, or administration. Many of us have become familiar with the drug categories like inflammatory conditions, multiple sclerosis, cancer treatments sitting at the top of our most expensive condition list. We've even learned the individual drug names from TV ads and our annual review meetings. Our finance and underwriting colleagues focus on a different aspect of the definition, the one in the PBM contract tied to the discount and rebate guarantees. Specialty drugs most likely come with a different set of terms, conditions, discounts, and rebates. And new specialty drugs that come out after the contract is signed have another set of prices, conditions, terms, rebates, with no guarantees for the most part. Even more complicated is the really fine print around limited distribution specialty medications. Affectionately known as the LDDs, we found that 20 to 25% of specialty drugs may be considered limited distribution drugs, meaning the pharma company who developed the drug has only approved one or more specialty pharmacies to dispense and manage the product. In some cases, this is very necessary because the condition is so rare and the treatment is so rare that a pharmacist, even a specialty pharmacist, needs additional training to know about how to discuss the product with patients and prescribers. And you guessed it, the LDDs are excluded from the specialty drug rebates and discounts, now creating another set of terms, conditions, and prices to monitor. What's coming next? What's in our pipeline? Rare diseases. You've probably heard quite a bit about rare disease and orphan drugs. What's an orphan drug? In the United States, an orphan drug was designated by law in 1983 as a drug that treats a disease or condition that affects fewer than 200,000 people in the United States. The term orphan was initially selected because without the financial incentives provided through the Orphan Drug Act, it was believed that drug companies would have no incentive to research and develop drugs like this. It was specifically tied to drugs where there was no reasonable expectation of profitability. Fast forward, and we have seen big changes. Before 1983, there were less than 40 orphan drugs. Today, over 600. Today, 1 in every 3 new FDA drugs approved has an orphan designation. And the most famous orphan drug in the world, Humira, has received multiple orphan designations on its way to becoming the world's best-selling drug. Global revenue in 2018 was almost $20 billion. I don't think we're worried about profitability on that one anymore. So how does this impact our discussion today? There are over 7,000 rare diseases identified in the U.S. Over 30 million Americans are said to be living with a rare disease. Each one on its own is rare, but overall the chance of having 1 or more patients in your population with a rare disease is obviously growing. Research and development is going to continue to focus. The Orphan Drug Act is going to continue to provide financial incentives. A benefits professional today needs to have a plan for if or when more of these orphan drugs is needed in their population. Now we're going to move to our first polling question, and it's about benefit design and when is the last time you reviewed your pharmacy benefit design. And in our next section, I'll explain why that's important.
So Barb, as we're looking at this polling question here and people are putting in their responses, what is an appropriate time, I guess, for someone to review their pharmacy benefit design? Like, how often should they consider this or look at this?
Well, as a pharmacy benefit consultant, I might be a little bit biased, but ideally every year. The PBMs have new solutions to solve new problems, and if you don't sign up for, say, the compound program exclusion, we all learned maybe 5 years ago, you could be paying for a $2,000 or $3,000 compound because you didn't elect the compound exclusion. The same thing is occurring now with the specialty medications and the different programs to manage their costs. So especially now, it's important to do an annual review.
Okay. All right. And we're seeing here, we'll share this very quickly. The results show that 61% of the participants who polled said that they have reviewed within the last 12 months. So that is actually great. And that leads us into the next section of our discussion. What are the options for taking control of your benefit plan's pharmacy costs?
So the reason we're starting with benefit design and the importance of benefit design is that some of the programs in the market do require an updated benefit design. When a new drug company comes out with an orphan drug or a specialty drug and they bring it to market at a new price, 100% of the time, I haven't found a drug in the last 3 to 5 years without one, the product is released into the market with a copay card and a patient assistance program. Those programs are based on a number of factors, but bottom line, you cannot fully take advantage of those programs if you haven't updated your benefit design. So benefit design is a client-specific discussion, and I'd love to sit down with every one of you and go through it, but for today, we're going to try to give some high-level guidance. The options to update your plan are pretty simple. If you think that you could benefit and you're comfortable benefiting from the value of the manufacturer assistance programs, they will cover the cost of the copay. It might make sense to adjust your design to tie to the value of the manufacturer program. If your copay is $50, the reimbursement will only be $50. If your copay is $1,000, the reimbursement will be $1,000. Sometimes I think a college tuition analogy is helpful here. Tuition keeps going up on the front end, but if you apply for the scholarships and the financial aid, you can get additional dollars back from the university, which will result in a lower cost. These programs are set up to make sure the drugs are affordable for the patient. The pharma dollars are set aside for the patient's copay. So many companies have said, why don't I increase the copay to take further advantage of these programs? If that's something that you feel comfortable doing, then there are a number of process and steps to go through, really based on your own data and your own population, to design those plans. We have an example on the next page of what that might look like. Today, a common prescription drug copay design is a $15 or flat copay for a generic drug, a regular drug, not a specialty drug, then a higher copay for a preferred brand, and the highest copay for a non-preferred brand. This is fairly common today. Sometimes the third tier is an excluded product. Sometimes there's an additional tier just for specialty. Sometimes specialty is considered a non-preferred brand. What we're recommending that you look at and consider and do the math on your own population is adding a tier for specialty, so that specialty generic, specialty preferred brand, and specialty non-preferred brand are treated differently. This allows you and your participants to take advantage of these incentives provided by the drug companies so that they're paying a bigger part of the cost of the drug. It also incents patients to be aware of generic specialty medications, which to date have been very limited, but will be coming to market more and more in the form of biosimilars. Without an appropriate incentive, employees and their physicians might overlook the opportunity to use a generic or biosimilar specialty product. So a lot of good information, a lot of good behavior incentives embedded. And again, these are just some examples. I would recommend that you sit with your benefits advisor and your financial consultant and go through what would make sense for you. So if your benefit design is updated, and we're assuming that you've already appropriately negotiated your pharmacy renewal and you're getting great discounts and great rebates and all that's guaranteed, and you're getting 100% pass-through on the rebates. If you haven't, we'll definitely, we're going to assume that you've already done that you sat with your pharmacy benefit manager and you've selected the appropriate formulary, you've put in all the clinical control programs. All of that foundation is built, and now we're looking at the copay card and patient assistance programs, and really, after adjusting the benefit design, being able to take more advantage of those programs. And like the benefit design, employer by employer, you need to kind of walk through this and decide what's appropriate for your population. Are you comfortable implementing an accumulator adjustment component so that the participant isn't getting credit for the copay paid by the drug company? I had one ERISA attorney tell me when we said out of pocket, we meant out of your pocket. So when these programs are in place, the drug company is funding the copay, the participant might pay zero, but without the accumulator adjustment, the dollars will be accumulating to a deductible and a maximum out of pocket. Again, this is a fairly complex technical topic to share with 500 of my closest friends, but if we could sit down and meet together, we can go through some examples of how that would impact you and your exact population. Most of all, you need to understand if your PBM or your PBM intermediary, a coalition, or an aggregator is going to help you with this. This isn't something that you want to take on by yourself, although we do have hub counselors every day who help patients and clients find these programs, that you really need to engage a PBM that has the staff for this. And the very largest PBMs have entire call centers set up to enroll patients in these programs. And every year, the number of patients and the dollars saved in these programs has grown dramatically. So the very large PBMs, for what we sometimes pick on them for some of their flaws, they've actually led the way in staffing and enrolling patients in these kinds of programs. Now, what do you do if your PBM isn't one of those market leaders or isn't up and running or hasn't invested in the technology needed to implement these new plans? There are entrepreneurs out there cropping up to fill this unmet need. This is America, and this is capitalism at its best. These companies may be a brand new startup, or they may be one part of a larger company that's already doing other medical work, but they will essentially, using a denied or a suspended claim as a trigger, these intermediaries will shop the alternative coverage. So if your PBM is available to do it, they'll shop the alternative coverage and plug in the discounts right into the adjudication engine that pays your pharmacy claims every day. If you go to an outside company, they have to find a way to capture the claim, either by getting it denied or suspended using prior auth or benefit design exclusions. They will capture that claim and they will go shop for you and essentially do the same thing. They're going to primarily look at pharma company patient assistance programs, pharma company copay cards, but some of them will also look at importation or medical tourism. There are also foundations, 340B, and other charity programs out there that could work. With any new program, there are some issues to work out, some growing pains, if you will. The primary issue with these new Innovator programs is that in most cases, they will not coordinate with your current PBM or health plan. In some cases, we have found some PBMs will partner directly with these firms so that the claims do stay integrated, but for the most part, the larger PBMs, the large health plans, don't want these claims going outside of the system. They want to solve the problem for you. These bolt-on companies also have to get paid for their service. They charge a fee or a percent of savings. In many cases, that can be very significant. The drug companies set aside certain funds for these programs, but they're not setting aside enough money to provide free drug for all commercial insured patients. Many of them are needs-based, so the patient has to qualify on their own financial need as well as the high copay dollar by the plan. So it's a multi-step process that doesn't solve all of the problems. But these companies are out there, they're actively marketing their solution. They have a role in education, and I probably get more questions about these companies every day than just about anything else. Let's talk about medical tourism briefly. So there are two types of medical tourism. There's overseas travel and personal drug importation, like the mail order that some of us may be familiar with some of the Canadian pharmacies that have been around for many years. These programs work off the fact that drug costs in other countries are much lower than the United States. It would be a separate webinar to go over why that is the case. But the FDA doesn't allow importation. There are situations where the FDA will not enforce the policy, and Corey will go through that in more detail in the compliance section. But the FDA has rules for reasons, and we'll go through those just a little bit here. These are the practical concerns of the medical tourism programs. Just like the bolt-on Innovator programs, your current carrier, PBM, TPA, and maybe even stop-loss vendor may not work with these firms. So if you're pursuing this, it sounds good to you and it's appropriate for your company, we highly recommend that you find out in advance if your carrier, PBM, TPA, and stop-loss vendor will consider the claim. The FDA's rules are in place to ensure product safety and integrity for the U.S. supply chain. Foreign country supply can't be determined by the U.S. system. So even if the product comes out of the very same factory, we can't ensure that the product integrity has been kept safe. Is it the temperature, sensitive storage, shipping conditions can't be confirmed. Within the U.S., there's a barcode and a way to track down every lot number on every prescription so that the FDA can feel comfortable that the drug supply within the U.S. is safe. There are many examples of the same bottle of insulin from the same manufacturer sitting out in a pharmacy in a foreign country with no refrigeration. The insulin becomes cloudy, it doesn't work. It's 50% less than the insulin in the U.S., but because of the way it was stored, it's no longer worth anything, and it's unsafe. So this is the FDA's rationale for the laws that we have. When you're thinking about sending somebody overseas to see a doctor, get a new prescription, and come home with a 90-day supply, you also have to take into consideration that many employees who need these drugs have chronic health conditions. They may not be fit to travel. There can be additional travel complications, and not all are eligible for the program. So when you hear about the trip to the Cayman Islands and the nice luxury resort you stay in, and the fact that at the end of the day, the trip is paid for and the drug is 50% less, don't forget to think through all of these other considerations. We've got these summarized here on the next page. Really, there's savings issues and then compliance issues to consider as well, even after the safety. The savings issues, a lot of times the drug files that are exchanged to produce the savings estimates don't include the rebates. Sometimes the rebates can be added in, but rebates are a very significant part of these expensive specialty drugs, so you can't overlook the rebates. You have to consider the fact that the claim may have to be reintegrated and it's sitting outside, not available for drug-drug interactions, drug allergy interactions, fraud and abuse, and other everyday drug safety edits that we're used to. Those claims are not on the same system, and that in and of itself can create an opportunity for duplicate prescriptions and additional cost outside of the program. The compliance considerations really are going to be covered by Corey, and I'm going to hand it over to him now to walk us through that discussion.
Thank you, Barb. So as with anything associated with employee benefits, we need to make sure that whatever the chosen solution is, whether that's excluding certain drugs or medical tourism, doesn't raise any potential compliance issues. And with that, let's take a closer look at how this plays out in the real world with two different scenarios that employers have actually faced. Now, you'll notice that both of these employers, they are self-insured, but remember too that even if your plan is fully insured today, that doesn't necessarily mean that this couldn't apply to you in a couple years, especially if moving to a self-insured funding is part of your long-term strategy. So employer one, they're a self-insured manufacturing company who hires a new entry-level employee at a salary of about $42,000 per year. Now, when they hire this employee, they also take on the claims of that employee's spouse and dependent child, who both happen to have some ongoing high-cost drug claims that total over $50,000 each month. So each month, the employer is paying out more in claims than the employee's annual salary. So here, the employer considers replacing the employee or possibly even excluding medications that the spouse and the child are on, just as a way to potentially manage some of these costs. Now let's take a look at another example. So employer two, they're a self-insured plan, they're a financial services company, they have many high-paid employees. Here they have the spouse of a CEO, or CFO rather, who has a rare disease, and then there's a new drug that comes on the market that'll treat the symptoms but not actually cure the underlying disease. If the spouse takes this drug, they'll be on this drug for the rest of their life, and the cost to the plan is approximately $60,000 per month. So here, what does the benefits team need to do to weigh their different options in terms of how do they address these various compliance issues in terms of can they come up with a solution and would that solution be compliant? So the ACA requires that health plans provide certain medications with no cost sharing for the plan participant. That means that the plan participant can go and get these drugs essentially for free. And free certainly sounds a lot better than even some of the low-cost generics that we hear about on the market. So these requirements are issued by the groups that we have listed here, the most prominent one being the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. Now, sometimes these medications are low cost, such as aspirin for the prevention of certain cardiovascular diseases or statins for reducing cholesterol. However, sometimes they're more expensive. So, for example, Truvada for the prevention of HIV-related illnesses was recently added to this. This is a branded drug. It's much more expensive. Plans have to cover the drugs that are on these preventive requirement lists. There's no way they can exclude them. Then for other medications, plans can place certain limits on the drugs or exclude them generally. However, any kind of limits, they need to be consistent with reasonable medical management techniques. And then, of course, they also must be generally consistent with how the doctors will prescribe the drug. So, for example, if you're going to place a restriction that a certain drug is limited to 2 or 3 refills, and it's a drug that a person might reasonably need to take for the rest of their lives, that's obviously not going to be a reasonable medical management technique. Plans also need to be concerned about potential plan discrimination related issues under some of the different laws that we have listed here. So any kind of blanket exclusion, if you're just going to exclude one class of drug or say all specialty type medications, there's a couple different considerations here that we need to talk about. So for example, mental health parity, this requires that plans treat mental health and substance abuse the same as medical/surgical are treated under the plan. A plan that say they have higher copays for non-preferred brand drugs used to treat mental health than the copays for similar drugs used to treat medical or surgical related conditions would be in violation of mental health parity. We also need to be concerned about the ADA. Now, the ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act, says that insurance distinctions can't be based on disability. So that would be called a disability-based distinction. These are not allowed. However, if there's an exclusion that applies equally to those with or without a disability, then that could potentially be allowed. Finally, we need to be concerned about HIPAA, which is really designed to protect some of the individuals related to retaliation on the basis of their certain health factors. So I'll give you an example here. when we think back to our previous two examples, these employers were clearly looking at the protected health information of the individuals involved. So for example, employer one, they knew which employee was incurring those high-cost drug claims, or rather, which employee's spouse and child were incurring those claims. Same thing with employer two. They knew that it was the CFO's spouse that was incurring or would be potentially incurring those drug claims. So what this highlights is that different plans do things differently with regard to HIPAA. I've worked with some employers where they look at the protected health information and let that guide their decision-making process. So for example, employer one, they might have made a certain decision based on the employee that was particularly impacted, whereas employer two might have made a different decision based on the fact that it was the spouse of a high-ranking employee. I can also tell you that other employers, they don't take that into account. They essentially have what we would call a blind policy, where they would look at whether or not these claims were incurred and whether or not whatever solution the plan was looking at, whether that was the appropriate solution without regard to who would necessarily be impacted. So what about going to other countries to purchase drugs, or possibly sending plan participants to other countries, or acting as some type of intermediary to get plan participants to receive some drugs from other countries via the mail? Well, as Barb had mentioned, in most cases, this isn't going to be legal. That essentially means that those busloads of people that we might hear about or even see traveling to Canada or traveling to Mexico to purchase medications, technically they're in violation of U.S. law. Now, the FDA, they do have a non-enforcement policy, but this is really pretty narrow overall and is designed to allow personal importation just in certain limited circumstances. So example one here lists one of those circumstances. This is an individual that travels outside of the U.S. and they unexpectedly have a surgical operation, and as part of the process, they need to take a prescription drug. Well, the FDA, they want this person to be able to bring that drug back into the U.S. They don't want the healing process to be disrupted in any way by not being able to bring that drug back into the U.S. The same thing goes for someone who, say they take a medication for a chronic condition, they go on vacation and maybe they lose it or maybe they forget it. They want that person to be able to have that prescription refilled outside the U.S. and then, of course, bring that back into the U.S. Now, examples 2 and 3, these are going to be examples that don't fall within the FDA non-enforcement policy. So, for example, individuals that they travel outside the U.S. specifically to purchase those drugs, so again, those busloads of people, or who contact or with third-party entities to have these drugs mailed from outside the U.S. into the U.S., those typically would not fall within the non-enforcement policy. And then finally, employers whose plans cover this or encourage it, for the most part, subject to, of course, some exceptions, they would essentially be taking on some additional risk for themselves by advocating for one of these programs. So Barb had given us a little bit of an introduction to medical tourism. And again, this comes in 2 different varieties. So this can be an individual who's specifically going to another country to purchase medication, or it could be someone that is working with an entity to import the drug via mail to the U.S. So this is kind of the next generation of medical tourism. Many years ago, we started to hear about individuals that maybe they're traveling to other countries, maybe they were traveling to Europe or to Asia or to Mexico or certain island countries to have medical procedures done. And the idea was that the cost savings would be so great that even when they factored in the travel to the other country, to the accommodations, maybe the extended stay to heal, maybe even bringing along a spouse or other relative to accompany you, they would still end up paying less by traveling outside the U.S. than having the same procedure done right here in the U.S. And the move with medical tourism as it relates to prescription drugs is kind of the same idea. The fact that the prescription drugs might cost so much less in other countries that individuals could travel outside the U.S., pay for the travel costs, and then ultimately save money by just bringing that drug back into the U.S. However, again, we really don't have this falling within the current law outside of that limited non-enforcement policy that really isn't designed to address these situations where a person is intentionally traveling outside the country to get these drugs. Some examples here, obviously we have these high-cost drugs. We're not looking to go outside the U.S. to purchase low-cost generic drugs. We're looking at some of the higher-cost biologics. We're looking at the Humaras of the world. And the idea is that individuals could travel outside, get some of these refilled prescriptions, bring them back to the U.S., and ultimately save money. Now, we do have to look at, of course, the true cost savings. So obviously we're thinking about dollars in one sense, but what is the price of those cost savings? So one, we have the potential unknown sources of these drugs. Some of the different solutions, they list out the countries that they work with, but there's no guarantee that you're actually getting that, a specific drug from a specific country at any specific time. Also, think about the fact that the U.S. is generally much larger than many of these other countries that we'd be getting these drugs from with these programs. A country like Belgium or Italy doesn't necessarily have the capacity to start exporting these drugs to the U.S. to fulfill U.S. demand. It's also possible that some of the manufacturers could catch on to this and start to withhold supply of these drugs to, Italy or Belgium or, anywhere else for that. Knew that they were being exported. Barb already hinted at the fact that we don't necessarily know what the chain of custody is during transportation. We might know that a drug comes from Australia, but what does the shipping of that drug look like? Does it pass through any other countries? Is it properly handled along the way? We don't know the answers to that, and these are just challenges that individuals and, of course, plans that work with these solutions would have to face. What about travel delays or travel accidents? Think about this. If there's, delayed flights, especially in the current environment with the coronavirus, if there's delayed flights, if there's, accidents related to travel, obviously this can be a great disruption, not only for the individual, but also for the employer. We also need to consider the employee's inconvenience. It might sound great to, go to Canada and, get to see the country and get your prescription drugs. But now what if all of a sudden you had to do that every 3 months? At that point, it might become more of an inconvenience to deal with than the cost savings is necessarily worth. And then finally, just taking all these different issues into account, we have the overall increased risk for the plan by taking on one of these solutions or using one of these solutions. We have two other considerations that employers need to consider when they're looking at different types of exclusions. So the first one is, if you're going to exclude a drug, does that merely shift the claim from a prescription drug claim to a medical claim? So one example I have here has to do with Harvoni, which is used to treat hepatitis and actually cure hepatitis. If you excluded a drug like that, wouldn't that ultimately lead to some increased claims overall just on the medical side? So think about it. Even though Harvoni is expensive, it's much less expensive than having to do a liver transplant and pay for hospitalization associated with that and ongoing drug claims associated with anti-rejection medication. So again, it's important to consider that if you're going to exclude a drug, it might just lead to medical claims. Finally, at the bottom, we need to make sure that whatever step we're taking towards this, that it's consistent with the employer's culture. If you're out there saying that your employees are family, you think of everyone as a family, but then you're making a decision that essentially limits a family member's access to prescription drugs, then obviously that isn't a consistent message and really sends a mixed message to employees. So all of these are different considerations that plans really need to look at when making these decisions on what solution is possibly the best for them. So we want to wrap up this section with just a few things to remember. So drug companies and all other key stakeholders are under pressure to provide better solutions, but of course change might take time. Of course, better solutions means not only better solutions, but also more cost-effective solutions. Nothing happens overnight. Emerging and evolving solutions, they potentially make some big promises, but it's important to take into consideration all the potential limitations and trade-offs that might come with those solutions. For example, if you're looking at a bolt-on solution, that might be great. However, if there's no integration with your existing plan and PBM and TPA, then obviously that solution starts to look not as good as it once did. Finally, a trusted advisor who looks at both the cost and the clinical and compliance implications is really best suited to help evaluate both the long and term solutions. So these are all things that we want you as employers to remember when looking at the various solutions that are in the market. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Rhonda for one quick polling question.
That's right. Thank you, Barb and Corey. We do have a question that we just launched for everyone today. If you can go ahead and complete that, that would be great. And Barb and Corey, we really want to thank you for the discussion today and the information that you've shared. And while the polling is going through, what I just want to say very quickly here, what stood out for me early on was a stat, Barb, that you stated that the average employer spent 19% of total healthcare dollars on pharmacy benefits, and that's a significant number, and that's only increasing over time. So your review of cost-saving options was really critical here. We're going to go ahead and close the poll because we do have some questions that we'd like to jump to. We want to keep the conversation going here, and so we'll get that set up very quickly. And looking at the first question that has come through, Barb, this is for you. If the coinsurance is applied to the specialty drug, but the plan has a $6,000 out-of-pocket max, will members still have a chance to qualify for manufacturer assistance?
That's a very good question, and someone doing some very quick math out there. But the short answer is the manufacturer assistance and the copay card programs are based on the participant's need. And if the participant has already hit their out-of-pocket max, they no longer have a need because they've entered into the part of the year or the part of their benefit where their out-of-pocket cost is zero. So that kind of patient is not going to qualify. That is one of the limitations of the programs. It also points out some of the intricacies because every year when the year starts over, if you can get a patient enrolled before they start incurring claims, it's likely that that same person could qualify early in the year and then have coverage throughout the year on one of the pharma programs. So it's a very highly technical approach when you start getting into the details.
Okay. Thank you. And we have another question here that's pretty interesting. Why is the same drug so much cheaper in countries outside of the U.S.? And I think, Barb, this is for you.
Yeah, and that we might have to do a spin-off webinar on that, but it's the United States drug cost is what the market will bear. In other countries, a manufacturer has to bid for a place essentially on the country's formulary, and they may pick one drug for rheumatoid arthritis for all of Italy, and that's the one that will be on the formulary, if you will, on the national plan. And the people who live there have way less choice. They have a choice of one drug, but that drug is very deeply discounted because of the single payer negotiation, which again, complete can of worms and debate on if that would solve it. But it's been the United States is really it's more expensive to buy the vast majority of medications in the U.S. than any other country.
Okay, thank you.
And you'll hear every politician this year claim that they have a way to fix it. Those of us who've been around for a while have looked at a lot of the different political proposals and seen a lot of them that were pitched last year have already been retracted. So still holding out hope, but not there is no quick fix for that one.
Okay. Corey, I have one that I think is for you. If an employer wanted to exclude drugs for a certain class, such as immunologic drugs, this other word I can't pronounce, so forgive me, does that violate ADA rules?
So it's really hard to say. Obviously, probably not if it's just a general exclusion for immunologic drugs. But if obviously there was a disability-based distinction made by the exclusion, then obviously at that point we would need to consider the ADA. But when it's just a general exclusion like this, then likely it does not.
And I mean, I'll jump in and say on a clinical basis, your immune system is what protects you from disease and keeps you well. And so if you're an individual that doesn't have a well-functioning immune system, it's going to be very difficult to live a normal life. And I think there could be other clinical implications, standard of care that could come into play, as well as that probably doesn't make for a very nice headline.
Here's another question for you. Should the employer assist employees in setting up a coupon for their drugs, or will the pharmacy carrier do this?
So this is Barb. I'll take that one. I would strongly recommend that you get your PBM to do that. And an employer could help somebody out, especially if it's an excluded product, to say, hey, have you looked on GoodRx, or have you looked on, look up the name of the drug. You may be able to enroll yourself. But then those claims will be outside of the system, and they won't be available for clinical management or patient history or safety. And so any of those programs, even for the expensive brand name drugs today, if you need a cosmetic drug or another drug that isn't excluded, those claims don't sit within the patient history within the health plan. So if at all possible, push the PBM, select a PBM who will help you, select a PBM that will proactively identify folks and perform the enrollment and the reach out and the education. They've made it their business to do that job, so take advantage of it.
Okay. This next question has to do with the number of employees. So the question is, to access the pharmacy utilization, do you have to have at least 200 employees? Or is there a certain number, I guess?
So, Barb, I don't know if you want to take that or if you want me to address it. I'm happy to share my thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'm trying to make sure I understand the question. Why don't you go ahead, and I'll keep thinking.
So if the plan is self-insured, then of course the data should be available regardless of size. However, if the plan is fully insured, then there's going to be limits placed on what data the carrier will release. I've certainly heard of certain carriers not sharing, prescription drug information for groups under a certain size. I haven't ever heard of the specific 200 employee threshold. It's possible, though, that an individual carrier sets that as their internal threshold, though.
I would agree. I have not heard 200 as a line in the sand per se, but this could be something where a carrier would prohibit a carve out, and the carve out might get you to a PBM that's more adept, and some of the carriers haven't stepped up to the plate yet with these programs. They've all reorganized and have gone out and acquired PBMs or affiliated with different PBMs. So they could be making these programs available soon if they are not today. So that could be a factor as well, where the number of lives could determine your path a little bit.
Okay. We have another question here that, Barb, I think this is something, obviously, you kind of addressed in the presentation, but maybe going into it. How are the alternate coverage programs handled by stop-loss carriers?
So that's been, there's no one answer to that. There are stop-loss vendors who have taken a position that they will not accept the international claims because they're illegal and they've determined that they want no part of those. There are others that if the TPA will process the claim as a treatment, they will add it as a treatment. It may take them 3 or 6 months. It's definitely not online real time. And in the meantime, all kinds of other claims may have occurred that interfere with meeting the deductible and the maximum out of pocket and other thresholds. So there are some who have agreed to do it for clients, which is why we say if you're looking at this, make sure you ask up front, but also get the fine details on how and when is that claim integrated. Is it manually reintegrated in 60 days, in 90 days, when they get around to it, and what does it look like? Also, on a clinical basis, if the claim comes back in as a treatment cost, we still don't have the prescription in the patient history. And the patient could actually go fill the same drug within the U.S. program in a U.S. pharmacy and not get any kind of duplicate therapy at it, no too early refill at it, and, worst case scenario, get a new drug that would have a drug-drug interaction or allergy. None of that would be available, even if the dollars are manually added later. So a lot to think about there. But the only way to find out is to ask. You've got to ask your CPA, your stop-loss provider, what would you do with this claim? And I'd probably get that in writing, because the sales reps might say yes, and then when it comes to making it happen, they may forget that conversation. So I would be very clear about that up front.
All right. And Corey, we have one last question for you. And this is a question I've heard before in the past, and the question is, can a faith-based employer legally exclude medications such as oral contraceptive from their pharmacy coverage?
So the answer to that is yes. So back when the ACA was first enacted, there had been some exceptions for faith-based organizations that allowed them to exclude contraceptives. And then since then, we've seen that this continue to evolve both as part of a couple different court cases and then also as part of some new legislation that has been issued by the current administration. So the answer is yes, faith-based organizations can do some exclusions for contraceptives, as can certain other organizations based on moral beliefs. So I would say that overall this has been expanded since the ACA was first enacted, but more organizations can exclude coverage for contraceptives.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for submitting some great questions. Thank you, Barb and Corey, for your presentation today. It really was informative, and we hope that everyone who participated found the information valuable and that you're ready to talk with a Hub advisor on how to create a compliant and compassionate health benefits program for your organization. Just another plug, if you are interested in continuing to get information from Hub about upcoming webinars and events, please text Hub to 888-1111. Complete the form for more information, and we thank you for listening today. This ends our webinar, and you may now disconnect.